Welcome back to Japanese religion. In this video, we're going to look at the early history of Japan and the Yamato period in which Japan had its first emperors. The Jomon period is roughly dated from 13,000 to 1000 BCE. During this time, Japan was inhabited by a hunter-gatherer population. They did some limited gardening as well, but they did not have rice farming or other types of agriculture. Modern scholars believe the Jomon are related to the Ainu people in Hokkaido. The Ainu were another ethnic group distinct from the majority ethnicity of Japan called Yamato, and nowadays they mainly survive in the northern island of Hokkaido. Historically, they were also prevalent in northern Honshu. The people who still identify as Ainu are also often mixed with Japanese, but some of their customs and music, for example, still survive. So this people, the Jomon, used stone tools and weapons, some of which were quite finely made. So despite the fact that they were hunter-gatherers and not farmers, they did have relatively sophisticated settlements, and they're relatively more sedentary, or they stayed in one place, compared to a lot of other hunter-gatherers. You can see the sophistication in their cord-marked pottery, which is named after the practice of creating designs in the pottery using basically cords that had ridges in them and using them to mark the clay that the pottery was made out of before it had hardened. They have elaborate designs on them, elaborate geometric patterns, similar to what you would see in civilizations that practice farming. They also had a lot of magatama, which is stone beads or jewels. It's possible that the shape of them was originally inspired to represent teeth that you might collect from animals. But in early Japanese history, this was a common shape for gems used in necklaces, for example. So we don't know much about the Jomon period culture or religion. They were probably animists like most other hunter-gatherer people. They worshipped nature spirits and ancestor spirits. There were people in the history of Shinto after the Shinto revival movement of the 17 and 1800s who hypothesized that Shinto goes back to the Jomon period. These theorists talk about Ko-Shinto, or the original primordial Shinto, as originating out of the customs and beliefs of the earliest known period of Japanese history. However, modern scholars aren't sure about this, more skeptical. If Shinto does go back to the distant past, it's more likely to be the period after Jomon, Yayoi. More recently, there's been a Jomon revival in Japan over the last couple of decades in the popular culture. Like one manifestation of this is people who get tattoos getting geometric designs based on those of the Jomon. So you could think of it as kind of like the Japanese equivalent of a tribal tattoo because they're abstract designs, but they're really just based on the distinct patterns used by this ancient ethnic group. Another example of that is modern Japanese artists, some of whom are creating ceramics or other arts inspired by Jomon designs. The Yayoi period is marked by migration from Asia, like the Korean peninsula, and these migrants brought farming, specifically rice farming, to Japan. Modern genetic studies have revealed that modern Japanese people are mainly descended from the Yayoi with some intermixture of the earlier Jomon. They can figure this out by doing DNA testing on ancient remains and also by testing modern Japanese people. So these people brought their own distinct culture and language with them. The ancient Jomon were probably mixed with the Yayoi, but if you look at the genetics, there's a higher proportion of Yayoi ancestry than Jomon in modern Japanese people. The Yayoi used dotaku or bronze bells for ritual purposes. For example, they would use them in rituals trying to ensure the fertility of fields of rice, and sometimes they would bury them as well, apparently in an attempt to create a blessing or avoid a curse or misfortune on an area of land. This ritual use of bronze bells continues into Shinto today. So it is possible that the earliest origins of Shinto date to this period. There were no written texts from this period, so it's only known from archaeology, not from history. Another common archaeological finding from the Yayoi period is bronze mirrors. These are similar in form to mirrors used in Shinto shrines, and you'll notice that it's similar in shape to the mirror that's part of the three treasures or imperial regalia of Japan. During the Yayoi period, there was apparently contact with Han Dynasty China. This would be in the later Yayoi period. We know this from a Chinese text that talks about the island of Japan, which is called Wa in Chinese. And this text says that the people of Wa clap their hands when worshiping. This is very interesting because that same practice is still a part of Shinto today. Before you bow and pray to a kami, you clap your hands. So that's another piece of evidence that the origins of Shinto may lie in this period. So following the Yayoi period is the Kofun period. This is really a continuation of that same civilization. However, during the Kofun period, there was a centralization of power in certain kingdoms. So you get these rulers that are controlling larger swaths of territory. And there are these very large graves called kofun that mark the burying places of these rulers. Large earthen mounds, sometimes in a keyhole shape, as you can see the one on the right, sometimes surrounded by a ditch or moat, as you can also see on the right. This one is very massive. It's Daisen Kofun in Sakai in Osaka Prefecture. So this ability to construct these massive tombs shows the growing power of the kings. There's also evidence of cultural connections with southern Korean kingdoms from this time. This period is generally regarded as ending in 538 with the introduction of Buddhism. Another custom they had was offering clay models called haniwa, often of people, sometimes of animals or other objects. These were given as offerings at the tombs. So basically a way of respecting the spirits of those who were buried there, and probably also intending to give good fortune for the afterlife. After the Kofun period, somewhat overlapping with it, was the Yamato period. The Yamato period was basically when one of those kingdoms that had been formed during the Kofun period gradually became dominant over the others, and this was the Yamato Kingdom. The kings of Yamato became the emperors of Japan. Beneath the kings or emperors were clans of nobles. So it was a feudal system in which the king or the emperor was the supreme leader, but below him were different families or clans of nobles who had authority over their own lands in the various provinces or districts of the kingdom. These nobles, like the emperor, had a religious function, at least initially in ancient times. So the heads of the clans performed ceremonies honoring their clan's kami. Each clan had its own kami who was regarded as the protector and patron of that clan. Now this religious function over time was mainly preserved in the emperor himself, who was basically the main intercessor or middleman between the rest of the people in the kingdom and the kami, specifically Amaterasu, but the other kami as well. Yamato, although it was the name of an ancient kingdom, it's also the name of the Japanese ethnicity. This is similar to the way the word Han is used in Chinese to refer to people of Chinese ethnicity, even though the name comes from one of the ancient dynasties of China. So it was during the Yamato period that Buddhism was introduced to Japan from Korea. It was probably originally brought by migrants from Korea, such as merchants who traveled from Korea to Japan to trade. There was also an official delegation from King Seong of the Korean Kingdom of Baekje, who sent a Buddhist delegation with a Buddha image and sutras to Emperor Kinmei of Japan in 552. And this basically started the spread, the adoption of Buddhism by the emperor and those around the imperial family, essentially the nobility who lived in the capital. Buddhism was initially mainly supported by one clan in particular, the Soga clan. In 558 or thereabouts, Soga no Umako ordered the construction of Hokoji, a Buddhist temple, which is now called Asukadera, and he used craftsmen from the Korean kingdom of Baekje to basically organize the construction. And on the right, you can see a picture of Asukadera today. This introduction of Buddhism, which is dated to around 538, marks the beginning of the Asuka period, which is basically the second phase of the Yamato. In addition to the Korean influence, which brought Buddhism to Japan, and there were contacts as well, just from trade, towards the later part of the Yamato period, there was a great deal of Chinese influence. In 603, Prince Shotoku, who was the regent of the Empress Suiko, at this time Japan was ruled by an empress. I believe Suiko was the first, and she was basically promoted to emperor to avoid a violent conflict between competing factions of nobles. By this time, the noble clans had themselves started to gain some power in the court of the emperor, and so they would often conspire to influence who the next emperor would be. To avoid a war, they proposed Empress Suiko as a kind of compromise because she had been supported by neither faction. But then a lot of the actual ruling was done by her regent, Prince Shotoku. Shotoku basically decided to import a new constitution or system of government based on that of Imperial China. So this was a bureaucratic form of government, you could say. The Chinese system, in addition to having nobility, placed a lot of power in ministers in charge of bureaus or offices that had other ministers or employees under them. The significance of this is that it was taking away some power from the hands of the nobility, who inherited their position as a result of their birth, and putting it into the hands of people who could be appointed by the emperor based on their merit. So not only did it create an independent power base from the nobles, ideally it was giving jobs in government to people who were qualified to fulfill them based on their capabilities, not just based on their birth into a noble family. And this system of government would persist for many centuries. This also saw the introduction of Chinese writing system and literature to Japan. Before this time, the Japanese people were illiterate. They did not have a writing system. They essentially initially adopted the classical Chinese writing system, and they even composed their earliest works of literature in classical Chinese, although they had ways of sounding or interpreting the Chinese characters in Japanese. They also adopted the Chinese calendar and the philosophical and religious traditions of Taoism and Confucianism. These essentially affected the literate culture around the imperial capital, but they did diffuse more widely throughout society. For example, many Taoist beliefs became combined with some forms of religion, especially esoteric religions practiced like sects of Buddhism or Shinto. But Taoism and Confucianism were also just very influential on the literature and ideology of the imperial court and capital. And finally, Chinese astrology and cosmology, that is the theory of yin-yang and wu-xing, or five elements, was adopted into the worldview of the literate class who ruled in the imperial capital. So this Chinese influence basically persisted throughout much of Japanese history, although it must be emphasized Japan did evolve their very own distinctive interpretations of Buddhism, for example, and their own distinctive customs, as well as retaining the Chinese influence. On the right is a picture of a performance of gagaku, or court music, at the Imperial Palace in Kyoto. Kyoto is the current imperial capital of Japan. It's not the political capital, but it's where the emperor has resided for many centuries. Some of the customs, ceremonies, dress, images of the imperial court date back to this early period and show some Chinese influence, although it did evolve in its own direction.